All right, guys. So we've reached the final installment of my interview with Dan Gaylinn, practicing psychotherapist. We got a lot of great stuff lined up for this one. We're going to talk about what makes someone a villain versus a hero. We're going to talk about the Stanford Prison Study and Dan's experiences with Philip Zimbardo, and we're going to reflect on psychotherapy in general. Stay tuned. Let's go. You knew Philip Zimbardo. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We worked together at Saybrook.
Awesome. Yeah. So I wanted to hear about your experiences with him and what you thought about his theories, as well as what you thought about, makes people do bad things or become a hero. Because I know that's a lot of his topic of exploration, and what we're talking about is a great gateway into that. So
yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because Zimbardo's, I think gotten some kind of revisionism in the last 5-10 years. His work, the Stanford Prison Studies.
You're right.
And it does sort of, his latter efforts will sort of speak to the hero's journey a lot more. What is the call to altruism and the call to heroism? Whereas, in the 70s, when he did the Stanford Prison Study, he was looking at what would drive people to do sort of terrible things, abuse their authority in essence. And I should say that the first time I encountered Phil was, he won't necessarily remember this, but I certainly did. I was in graduate school, and he was an adjunct professor, or he was teaching in any case at a similar psychology graduate school, basically across the street from mine in Palo Alto, called PGSP. And they were hosting an event that was, I think they called it Phil Zimbardo, Dr. Zimbardo on the couch. And it was just sort of like a celebration of him and his work. He had been sort of well regarded. His research is basically in every introductory psychology textbook. It is sort of the entree into social psychology, him and Milgram, and among others, at Bandura. And the event happened to be, I think it was like the day of or the day after the Abu Ghraib scandal broke out of, what was that, Iraq, Afghanistan, where U.S. military...
They were torturing prisoners?
Were torturing prisoners. And, images were surfaced where, they were, doing all kinds of outrageous, degrading things with the prisoners, very similar to what Zimbardo himself had discovered
with that prisoner study
in the prison study.
Wow.
I'm sure you're familiar with it. I'm hoping that the listeners or whoever is watching this is also similarly familiar with it.
Maybe you could give me just a very brief summary of what, because it'd also be interesting to hear your perspective on his conclusions of that, and what do you think about that study? Was it more moralistic? Did it?
Yeah.
Was the conclusions that were reached, were they accurate?
Well, it's very controversial, right? The findings were very controversial. I don't think you could do that study these days. So I don't think you could pass ethics board.
Right. Oh yeah. It seemed like it got pretty horrific there for
he had to shut it down after, I think it was 2 weeks. But in essence, what he did was he turned a basement level floor in a psychology building at Stanford into a makeshift prison, where he arbitrarily assigned college students who were participants in the study to be either a prisoner or a guard in this makeshift prison, just randomly selected. And
these were all college students.
They were all college students. They were getting credit. They were, it's pretty standard that a lot of psychology research is performed with, college age students, and they get credit, or they get nominal amount of money. They're also learning about psychology while they're participating, so it's makes sense. And these were randomly assigned college students. I don't remember what the sample size was, but a good number, somewhere around 20, 25, roughly. And they were asked to sort of take on a role of prisoner or guard. And what Zimbardo discovered after, a very short amount of time, 4 or 5 days, that the guards eventually exhibited rather sadistic behaviors against the prisoners, forcing them to do, shameful things, humiliating things, and subservient and taking on these behaviors. And so and to the point where Zimbardo eventually had to shut it down at the behest of his girlfriend at the time, who sort of learned about what was going on in the study, said, and Zimbardo himself, who was sort of a kind of a makeshift warden, by putting on the study, he was sort of playing the role of warden in this prison. That, he was almost as much caught up in that,
like the fantasy of it, or
the fantasy of it, that he did not see how abusive it was.
Wow.
Right.
Wow. In his headspace too, he was stuck in the frame of that, I guess.
Right. Now, at this point, I should say that in the last 10 years or so, it has been revealed that many of the guards of the prison were coached to take on this sadistic role, that it did not happen naturally or, by virtue of their situation or inclination, that it was more of a sort of performance on behalf of the study, what's called a demand, what do they call a demand characteristic in social science. It's a limitation.
Like for fulfilling a job that they tell them this is what you should be doing, so this is what I'm going to do.
Right. Like I'm doing this on behalf of the study. This is what I'm supposed to do. I'm playing the role of a sadistic guard, and that, and so to say that that this is sort of like innate in human nature that will be exhibited as a result of a situation is not entirely
interesting.
It's somewhat disingenuous.
That was one of the conclusions, right? That he was saying, put into a certain situation, normal people can start to do evil things.
Yes. Now, one of the things that's kind of fascinating is that the study took place in the 70s, around the Vietnam War. And you had college kids who were sort of like in the zeitgeist of counterculture, hippie, as I'm sure Zimbardo himself was sort of situated to sort of make a political point with his research, to stand on science, to condemn Vietnam or, war itself.
So there was actually like an internal motivation to kind of condemn what's happening in the world,
which he himself was blind to. I mean, and this is sort of a broader problem of social science, is that like there is no pure perspective. It's subjective. We have a vantage point. We can't help it. There's bias implicit in the effort, right? So the best we can do is call out our biases, and that is not comprehensive. It's inexhaustive. We can't call out all of our biases. We don't know them all, but we can do our best. What Edmund Husserl called epoche, which is this stepping back. In a sense, that's what the meditations help us to do, or what a psychedelic would help us to do, is to step back, to see the bigger picture, to recognize that, I'm playing a role, I'm serving a function, but it isn't the full picture.
Like the bias is not the reality, essentially.
Right, exactly. The bias is not the reality. The map is not the territory. Yeah, this is my reality tunnel. And so he had this reality tunnel he was bringing to bear on this study, and he found, in some sense, what he was looking to find. But my point was, or not point, but like at least it was worth kind of acknowledging. My first encounter with Zimbardo was the day after Abu Ghraib scandal broke. So it was like, it was a perfect setup for him to just say like, see, I told you, I published this research 30 years ago. And what did you expect?
It's like a confirmation bias, I guess.
It was
like
confirmation bias. And everybody was sort of in awe. You're right. Like, you know, thank you. And you know, what are we going to do about Afghanistan now? Or like, you know, the Bush administration, you know, like there was a continuation of that same sort of bias and inclination. Now, the fact that this has sort of recently come to light in the last 5-10 years, that it's that these participants were somewhat coached, is sort of reflective of the ways in which maybe there's been a turning of the tide, politically speaking, where the new counterculture is sort of conservative, you know, and and like the status quo or the mainstream, you know, is the left. You know?
Yeah, I can see that. You know? I mean, even like what's happening now, you can kind of see that's what's happening. Like all of the riots and all of the things that are happening now, like that actually is become like the mainstream. You go on social media now and everyone's,
yes.
It's everybody.
And communism. And I mean, it's a little scary, like just to sort of see it unfold like this. But kind of back to what we were talking about before is like, if you can see it for what it is, then you can stay safely outside the fray.
Yeah, right.
Or at least in
I think that's also like tying that into like Jordan Peterson. I think that was also the controversial issue with Jordan Peterson too, wasn't it, for a while, is that he was actually bringing up these traditional conservative like ways of seeing the world, and everyone's like, no, like that's horrendous. You can't do that.
Imagine doing that in academia and in psychology, you know, which is predominantly lefty in its inclination, in its orientation, but you know, academia. So yeah, I mean, it was, and I find you know, even as a psychotherapist, that like I'm in some ways bucking the trend by being, you know, not liberal.
You are, you know, pretty accomplished in terms of your academic stature, as well as you're a licensed, you know, like professional in this field. You know, is there this bias that's kind of looming over you of saying that you have to kind of go with the trends? You know, because things are liberal now, do you have to think in a liberal headspace when you do your practice?
Well, that
versus the conservative.
That I appreciate the question in some sense, because it does tie back to somehow where we started this conversation, which is that I kind of am a bit of an iconoclast by temperament. And I will sort of find where the rule is and push on it and sort of dance on it and cross it and see if it's a legitimate rule. I mean,
yeah, be a contrarian in a sense.
Yeah, somewhat contrarian or iconoclastic. Obviously, there are, you know, very valid and worthwhile like ethical rules and guidelines that are that I don't push upon. But you know,
I got to update my headphones.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll give you a second.
Yeah.
So to your question, you know, I find that like it may not be what my clients are expecting or anticipating or finding with other encounters with therapy, but I find that I try to smuggle these kinds of insights in, as strange as that might sound, you know.
For the counter argument, just to keep everything balanced and not having to go from one bias to another, is that?
Yeah. I mean, best thing I can do for my clients is to help them to think for themselves, right? To help them to trust themselves, and so there is a bit of a trickiness. Is like, yes, you're entitled to your reality, but it's not at the expense of everyone else's, right? And that there is a shared reality that we all have to live in,
right?
And that you do have a means to access it in a way that doesn't have to impinge on anyone else's, including your own. Right.
Like you don't have to build yourself up. You don't have to be bringing other people down. You just build yourself up.
I mean, these are things that we learn, you know, growing up, but you know, it's hard to necessarily put it into practice and live that way. And, you know, so I find, you know, having been in academia for most of my upbringing until, you know, I graduated about a decade ago, a little bit more than that. I had been sort of seeing the world through the liberal lefty worldview, and then sort of came to my senses, as it were, and I lost that whole part of my life. I lost a lot of my social contact and relationships and friendships, and it's still happening. I mean, just last night, on social media, I posted something, and a friend from college, who I went to a very liberal, progressive college called Oberlin, and it's even more so now than it was, and it was pretty bad, strongly that way when I was there. Misinterpreted what I said, and unfriended me, and it's a shame.
Yeah.
It's just how it goes.
Just to wrap it up, what turns someone into an evil person? What turns someone into a hero? What's the
Wow.
Dan synopsis of that?
Find out what what makes you extraordinary. How you are uniquely. See, I think each of us is sort of like a bit of a dialectic, what's called the dialectic or a paradox. And I don't know if I can. I have to talk this out a little bit to get to. My pithy one-liner. I'm reading a lot about Stoicism lately, and how it underlies the philosophy of psychotherapy in many ways. There's a lot in there. It's hard to sum up in a single sentence, but in essence, it's about being able to face fear with a sense of equanimity, which I think is very Buddhist in a lot of ways.
Right.
Accepting life on its own terms and not being sucked down by it, and studying, Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus and the types who were able to conjure in their minds the worst of their possible fears and their ultimate demise without succumbing to it. And that, when death finally comes, it's something that they've been preparing for their entire lives. And so they're able to do it with grace and dignity.
Wow. Right.
Yeah. And serve as a model for those around them.
Right.
And teach them and never stop teaching that whole process. I mean, it's an aspirational quality for sure, but I think it's available to anyone.
Yeah. And it sounds like basically what we were talking about before about the concept of optimizing yourself and reaching your potential.
Yep.
These same qualities are,
yep.
Overlapping in it. So,
yeah. The primacy of the state of mind again, right. It's like all the way to the very end, to the, you maintain a kind of, like I described, this is just now coming to me. I described sort of how to cultivate the state of equanimity with my clients is sort of like balancing an overfull glass of water, where it's sort of peeking over the rim of the glass and you just don't want to spill a single drop. So you're so still, you're so calm, you're so attentive.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And you're able to sort of maintain that equanimity, that peace. And
that's the balance.
That's the balance.
The subtle balance that we're striving for.
And you maintain it even as you die, right? Or even as you're in the worst of upheavals. Not that you're not affected by feelings, not that you're not emotional. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you're affected by feelings and you can be emotional, but you don't lose that equanimity while you are, in the throes of your feelings.
Of these extreme situations, or that these situations that you take as extreme.
Yeah. You don't lose your head as you
wow.
live.
Yeah.
So that's an aspirational.
Yeah. No,
sometimes it look from the outside. I remember, I think it was George Bernard Shaw, from the outside, the man who loses control of his horse and charges ahead into battle looks like a hero, when in fact he's just lost control of his horse. He looks great, but he's just he's spooked. He doesn't have that headspace. So what looks one way from the outside may not in fact be what it is from the inside. Whereas someone who's sort of in an equanimous state of mind may not feel like a hero when they're undergoing chemotherapy, for example. But someone who's witnessing them do that with equanimity can be in awe of what they perceive to be heroic.
Right. Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah. It's a very subtle internal thing, but that's what is really important.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe there's heroism all around us if we're able to witness it
And pick up on it, I guess.
and pick
That's
up
the
on
idea
it.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And every day is an opportunity too.
Right.
Maybe. I mean, this is an attempt to wrap things up in a nice, neat bow. But
And I think you did a good job.
thank you, Luke. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate this very much. I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, definitely, Dan. I thank you so much for
You
the
did a
time
very
and the
good job as
insights.
well.
Okay, talk to you later.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
All right, so what do you guys think of the Stanford Prison Study? What do you guys think makes someone a hero versus a villain? Let me know in the comments below. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this installment of the Hidden Knowledge interview series. I'll be back soon with some more great videos. Until then, do what makes you strong. Stop doing what makes you weak.